everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of our Dariel conference. In this, our sixth session in our conference, we will be talking all about branding, beliefs, and a healthy dose of reality. I'm joined today by Peter Ferreira and Julian Exenberger, and we're going to have some really interesting conversations around topics like branding and how to build your brand and why you should build your brand. And we're also going to hear from Julian all about our decision making and how our biases oftentimes affect the ways that we approach things. As always, feel free to leave us a chat, leave us a comment, leave a question. And if you'd like to see more Dariel content, you can also join and follow us on YouTube, where all of this content will be released afterwards. Lastly, before you leave, you'll also see a little survey pop up. Please take 2 minutes to give us some feedback on how we did. It helps us to provide more amazing content to you guys. And without further ado, we're going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us, Peter. I'm going to hand over to you now. Let's hear all about personal brand.
Thanks so much, Janine, and thanks everyone for joining us, Darielites and non-Darielites. Nice to virtually see all of you. I'm going to be talking today about stating it until you make it, how to conjure a personal brand out of almost nothing. So, without any further ado, let's start. Here's what the internet says about building a personal brand. Figure out who you are. I'm sure you all know who you are. Determine what you want to be known for. Well, yeah, if you're going to build a brand must be known for something. Define your audience. Of course, I suppose that's logical. Research your desired industry and follow the experts. This is quite an old article. I wonder what they meant about follow, like literally. But anyway, ask for informational interviews. I can't imagine any introvert being able to do this, to be 100% honest. Prepare an elevator pitch. Anyone can prepare an elevator pitch, but how many people can deliver it and deliver it effectively? Number 7 is ask for recommendations. I absolutely agree with this. You'll see I've got a number and I've given a number of recommendations on LinkedIn. Grow your online presence, or presence in this case. And remember that your personal brand isn't just online. I agree with most of those, but here's what the Peter says. And I've got the microphone, so to say. So whoever you choose to be and whoever you are, your brand should be authentic. So be authentic when you're building your brand and engaging as your brand. Be known for being mostly helpful and speaking your truth. You don't need to be an expert to start building your brand, especially if you're just starting out as a new graduate or a junior person in your industry. Maybe it's better to be known for being helpful. Speaking your truth, absolutely. Liars are very, very quickly found out. But speaking your truth is also talking about who you are, where you came from, your struggles, what you've overcome, your achievements, being proud of yourself. Rather than knowing your audience, I'd say know your hashtags, the ones you post and the ones you follow. Those will help you to build your credibility immensely quickly. And this is an interesting one. Follow people you admire as well as people you disagree with. You don't want to create just an echo chamber. Then you're only going to hear the same opinions that you already have. You're not going to be able to grow. It's good to learn how to disagree. Everyone should do it rather than immediately disengaging with those people. And it provides you with a different way of seeing things and potentially a different opinion on a topic that you maybe held quite close to your heart. Ask questions. Ask lots of questions. This is the easiest way. If you're engaging with someone, just ask a question. What do you do? How do you do that? What makes it special? Rather than writing a elevator speech, write a kick-ass bio. When people click on your link after you've asked them a question, they'll see this person that they want to connect with. That's a great way to start building your brand. Ask for recommendations. You'll see it's exactly the same as the previous slide. I 100% agree with this. And in a post-COVID world, where you start building your brand is online. Whether that is as a professional, whether it is as an artist. If you're going to start today, start with an online audience in mind. Right, so this is how we do it. How do we state it until you make it? You need to figure out what you know, and you need to ask about what you don't. So that's the content that you need to create. People love to talk about themselves and their work. So either people that share an industry with you or an interest with you, or those people that you are interested in. Ask them questions, engage with them, and that'll help you build presence and credibility. Starting out, be prepared to be schooled. You're going to need to learn how to disagree. There are social media rules, but often people want to get to a resolution online. And disagreeing amiably is a skill that I think not many people have. That being said, you should also know when to use the power of the block. Sometimes people won't ever agree with you. Sometimes they're just out to be trolls. Feel free to block them. You need to make regular posts. If you're going to make an online brand a thing, you need to post at least once a week. What's nice about that is that you don't need to create a thought leadership piece once a week. Just asking questions, sharing a very interesting article with the comments on your opinion about that article. And then occasionally throwing a cat amongst the pigeons. I'm definitely guilty of that. Unfortunately, the most popular post I've ever made on LinkedIn was when I was criticizing other recruiters, which is not a good thing, but hey, it just shows that the cat amongst the pigeon does work. And then comment on trending posts or those that your colleagues or target influencers are engaging with. The more conversations that you have, the faster you can become a perceived expert or influencer. And that's the whole point of an online brand. Online perception is powerful. I'm in no way in real life the incredibly polished talent acquisition expert that I think a lot of people on LinkedIn think I am. I'm generally quite clumsy, a little bit goofy, but online, I'm perceived as this person. LinkedIn told me I'm an influencer. I nearly fell off my chair laughing. Remember that no one is as perfect as the image they portray on social media. The nice thing about an online brand is that it can morph and change. Your persona can change in key ways if you want to engage with different audiences. But it's only going to be able to be a long-term engagement, and people are only going to really feel that you're a real brand if you actually are authentic and real. And if you're serious about making this a thing, you need to understand the algorithms of your chosen platform. For example, LinkedIn comments are much more powerful than likes and shares. So you want to get as many comments on your posts as possible. So that's pretty much it. Is, you need to be persistent. You need to be consistent. You need to be authentic. You need to be helpful. And remember that emotions are temporary, but screenshots are forever. So if you're going to have an argument, make sure your emotions don't get the better of you. And that's how you conjure a personal brand out of almost nothing online. Any questions?
Right. Thanks so much for sharing this, Peter. This is absolutely awesome. I'd love to know, what do you think is the value add for someone as a software developer or a technologist to build a personal brand? Why would you invest that sort of time if you are not in talent acquisition, for example?
So, well, there's two main things. I mean, one, it can definitely stroke your ego to be seen or known as a powerful brand or influencer. The other thing is to get greater opportunities in your career, to speak, to have exposure to new technologies and new opportunities. If you're the first person that someone thinks about, then you're going to be the first person that gets the opportunities that that person thinks about.
Absolutely. And I think it's definitely a wise thing to say that screenshots are forever. And actually, Jeff made a little comment here as well. Guys, when you post to us, please remember to select panelists and attendees so we can all see your comments. I think the other thing that I'm always wondering is, would you recommend a specific platform for someone to start building their brand? Obviously, we prefer LinkedIn for many reasons, but is there perhaps another one that you like or that you wish you could play around with?
I'm too old to understand TikTok, but that's probably where I would start if I was to start building a brand now. It would definitely be on TikTok. I don't know if you can get, I mean, are there companies on TikTok? I had it for a couple of days, but my preference is definitely on LinkedIn and probably on Instagram. But if I was to start today, it would be TikTok.
Awesome, definitely. Gilad wants to know, does China count as a company? Because they are definitely on there. And Eon feels Twitter is also a valid option. Have you delved into Twitter?
I have. I was an early adopter, but it kind of got a bit toxic. I understand it's gotten less toxic and is more about information sharing and so forth now. But I don't really have the energy. So I do know that my LinkedIn posts go to Twitter, but I don't really engage. I don't have that account on my Twitter app, for example.
Awesome stuff. And then any last advice that you have for anyone starting, rookie errors to avoid? What would you recommend if you were the first person starting this sort of thing?
Get a profile picture. That would be the first thing. Doesn't have to be super recent. Like mine, there's much less gray in my my LinkedIn profile picture, but I'm definitely still recognizable. And don't be scared to start. You can make as many mistakes as you want. Just don't be, offensive or racist or sexist or anything like that. And ask questions. People love to talk about themselves. Worst that can happen is they ignore you. And so what? You've at least got a little bit of a digital footprint there, and you've started the journey.
Absolutely. And then we have a question from Vincent. He has asked, what would be the risks of not building an online presence?
The risk is that you'll probably miss out on some opportunities that you might not have missed out on. That would be probably the big risk, but it's if you want to. No one has to. There are a lot of successful people that don't have an online presence whatsoever. Don't get me wrong. One of my most successful friends only joined LinkedIn this year when he became the CEO of a business. I see Stacey's got a question. I heard someone recently mentioning that living a brand 24/7 is very tiring. What are your recommendations in that regard? If you're authentic, it's not tiring because you're just being yourself. That's a very easy cop-out answer. Obviously, like I said, I'm not 100% the person that I represent on LinkedIn. So I choose the hours to be that. It's kind of my work hours. I'm LinkedIn Peter during work hours, and at 5 p.m. I get off that platform. There's no reason for me to engage beyond that. I've chosen that time for my brand to be active, but it's much easier because it's also mainly authentic, just slightly more polished.
Absolutely. All right, guys, we have time for one more question, but otherwise it has been fantastic. We will continue to answer your questions in the comments as well. Thanks so much for putting this together, Peter. This was really interesting. I think it's quite a valuable thing to look at, especially in our day and age. And I hope that people will remember that screenshots are forever and to just go and have a good, let's give it a try. It's always good.
Yeah, just go and do it. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much, Peter. All right, so while we're going to continue answering questions, we are now going to hand over to Julian. Julian will be sharing with us something a little bit different. So Julian, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you. Would you like to get your video started? And I'm going to mute so long. All right, I see your notes. Just maybe it's
wrong one. Oopsie.
It's okay.
Is that better?
Much. You are good to go.
Okay, awesome. Okay, thanks everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about productive cynicism. Picture of the person there in the slide is George Orwell. George Orwell happens to be one of my favorite writers, and he's to me is one of the patron saints of being cynical. So I'll actually be using quite a lot of his stuff in this talk. But I want to start by asking all of you, are you a useful idiot? Okay, so I don't know if you know who that person is. That person there is Joseph Stalin. During the Cold War, the term useful idiot was used to describe a person who helped propagandize a specific cause, who didn't fully understand what that cause was actually about. And they were cynically used by the cause's leader to help advance the cause. So a little bit of background here, right? So Joseph Stalin killed millions of people. One of the little known facts about history is that just before the beginning of World War II, there was a treaty signed between Nazi Germany and the USSR. It was called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. One of the secret things about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was that it basically carved up Eastern Europe between Nazi Germany and the USSR. And basically, the USSR is partly responsible for World War II. But for 17 days, where Stalin held back and didn't invade Poland because he wanted to see what the reaction would be from all the people, the USSR and Nazi Germany would have actually combined together, started World War II. And this is a fact that's not very well known. Part of the reason is obviously the one of the regimes stopped to exist after the war, and the other one had a notorious habit of concealing secrets. But a key thing was that many Western intellectuals, and communism in the West has always been something that has been popular among academics and intellectuals. These people became apologists for the USSR and the communist regime, and they often were used as these useful idiots by the USSR to kind of advance their cause. Now, of course, there was one person who knew exactly what this all was about, and he was George Orwell. And like I said, George Orwell to me is one of the patron saints of cynicism. Cynicism is regarded as something negative, and it is, but if it allows you to actually understand the motives of people and to help you put those things into perspective, it does allow you to get a better understanding of the world around us. And certainly one of the things that cynicism encourages in general is to ask questions, and ask questions not only of what it is that they're selling, but also of yourself. This quote here is from 1984, the famous novel that George Orwell wrote. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And of course, this was a way that George Orwell used to illustrate the cognitive dissonance that was going on inside this regime. And each point here was used to strengthen the standing of the regime within the population. And if you look at his writings, he always used the middle class and the educated classes to actually advance the agenda of the underlying regime. And I want to focus a lot on ignorance because I think that is a core aspect of what I'm talking about today. So this is how I believe most people like to live. They seem to take the world at face value. And obviously, I mean, we hear a lot about ignorance. And certainly one of the key things about ignorance is it makes it difficult to adequately make judgments on situations on the world around us. It prevents the ability to actually think critically about things that are going on, both for you, around you, or any decisions that you're busy making. And I can almost promise you, if you're an intelligent person that's living in some form of ignorance, you will eventually have some type of disillusion. You will become disillusioned with whatever it is that you're busy doing. Now, most of us in the room have some type of education, BSc, ComSci, whatever the case may be. But what I want to tell you is that education isn't enough. So the picture there's two very important people in this picture. The first one is Che Guevara in the background in the beret, and the person in the forefront is Jean-Paul Sartre. And Jean-Paul Sartre was almost typical of the type of intellectuals who used to support and were used by the communist regime to kind of advance their cause. So a little bit about Jean-Paul Sartre. He was an existential philosopher. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1964. He is considered one of the most influential and important philosophers of the 20th century. Unfortunately, he was also an apologist for the USSR and similar movements, despite all the mounting evidence that these guys were actually getting up to no good. On Che Guevara, he made this comment, not only an intellectual, but also the most complete human being of our age. Unfortunately, the most complete human being of our age was notorious for being known for his love of murdering people. In fact, I think in his book, he even mentioned that one of the things that really got him excited and full of adrenaline was the smell of blood and gunpowder. Another little known fact is during the Cuban Missile Crisis, after Khrushchev decided to disband all the missiles and take them back to the Soviet Union, Che Guevara flew into a complete rage, called Khrushchev personally and told him what an idiot he was. And among other things, he made the comment that he would happily have used him. So the most complete human being in the world would happily have started World War III and killed millions of people. Of course, again, going to my buddy George Orwell, he understood this, right? So, and he sums it in that quote. And the reason he was saying that is because education breeds its own forms of biases. You're also the outcome of whatever it is that the teacher is trying to teach you. And at best, education can only give you a sliver of knowledge of a specific field at a specific time. Academics are, of course, seen as living in an ivory tower, and they tend to struggle to see the world not as it is, not as they want it to be. And typically, they often adopt ideas that are out of touch with everyday people. So he understood that to really appreciate the world, you need to look fundamentally at the people around you. And that's not something that you're going to learn in education. And that's not to say, obviously, that education isn't important in combating ignorance, but you do need to take some aspects of the world around you and learn to recognize some patterns. Okay, so why am I actually qualified to tell you any of this stuff, right? So firstly, let me say there's nothing special. This slide here is basically a bell curve. So I've positioned where I am on the bell curve. All right. So I don't think I'm stupid, but I'm certainly no Stephen Hawking. And as much as I would like to be, I'm also no Lionel Messi. The only thing really that I can say is that I've got 20 years of hindsight being in this business. So I've been in a lot of the positions that you're in, and I've made a lot of the mistakes that you guys are about to make throughout your life. The only thing really that I can say that I'd really like to get out of this is to say that maybe somewhere I can impart some of my hindsight so that you can get to the position in 10 years instead of 20 years. So the first thing I'd actually like to talk to you about and make you aware of is the concept of in-groups and out-groups. Okay, so basically an in-group is really something you belong to where you share where you have some type of shared experience. Out-group can be anything from a tribe of people living in the Amazon to a political party to a student body to just a fan group of your local football club or whatever the case may be. Everybody belongs to some form of in-group. And obviously, every in-group has a specific out-group. And generally, the out-group is somebody who you don't have a shared experience with. So you might be a bit more of a mundane type where you say have Liverpool versus Manchester United. That might be some example. Everybody from the one group hates the other group. And there's been a lot of research done on in-groups and out-groups. The slide that I have here is some research that was done on in-group and out-group thinking. And what they basically did is they took a group of people that belonged to a specific in-group and they analyzed their brain activity. The way they did this analysis was, first of all, they heard an inspirational quote by a member of their own in-group. Okay, so that is picture A. As you can see, there's areas of the brain that lit up this, because obviously that message that was coming through resonated with that person, because it's inspirational from the same person in the in-group. They took the same statement and let it be said by some member of the out group, and basically nothing happened. So the brain almost filtered this out and decided that I'm not interested in this, despite the fact that what the person of the other out group was saying was exactly the same. The final one, of course, was when you have a non-inspirational quote. And when I say non-inspirational, it probably meant something that you might have felt goes against your values of the group. And basically, the brain almost had the same reaction. Now, obviously, this is an emotional reaction. And in this case, it's probably like some form of outrage or something that you would use that inflames you against that person of the out group. Okay. As you can see, a lot of thinking is based purely on your group affiliation. It isn't actually based in any reason or rationale or anything like that. And since everybody belongs to some form of in-group, humans use this to reinforce stereotypes about the other group. And I'm sure, like, there's no room, if you look at this, there's no room for a little bit of confirmation bias. Okay, so now you might be saying, all right, this is pretty heavy stuff, maybe, you know, we're not here to talk about politics, but the fact is, you know, we have quite a few in-groups and out-groups in the technology space. Okay, so imagine if you're building a house and two builders came up to you, and one was arguing about the fact that they should use Lafarge cement, and the other one was arguing about whether they should use PPC cement. You probably don't care. I think your response would be, well, you know, they're both well-known brands. Which one is cheaper? And this is exactly what happens in the tech world. And this, of course, the .NET versus Java thing is a classic example of in-group and out-group thinking in the technology world. Now, both of these have their pros and cons. Both of them have, their growth is basically flat in the market. Both are bloated. Both have been around for the better part of 20 years. .NET is now obviously approaching its 20th anniversary. And I can almost promise you, when people make choices about which technology they want to use, it's very rarely down to the technical merits of one technology over the other. Most of the time, it's really down to soft issues that affect that person. Usually things like, what's my budget? What are the platforms I run in my environment? What skills are available? How much do the skills cost? Where do I get the skill from? Can I exploit other areas, other geographic areas, for example? And quite frankly, guys, like after 20 years, if you're still arguing about Java versus .NET, I can almost promise you that the Python guys and the JavaScript guys are laughing at you. It's like neither of these techs are actually being used by the cool kids in any way, really. So that brings me to the next point, right? Safe spaces are bad for you. Now, earlier I showed you on a picture of how the brain works when you have in-group and out-group interaction. However, when you actually go and argue and you discuss controversial topics with somebody from the out group, the brain lights up. It's like an orchestra, like bits and pieces of your brain light up and start working. However, when you have the same chat with somebody from your in-group, only those small bits of the brain actually light up. Okay, and the fact is that being inside a safe space, inside your own in-group, basically forces your brain not to think. The only way that you can actually get your brain to think is to step out and speak to people of the out group. In fact, you can almost say like just talking to people who belong to your in-group is the equivalent of feeding your brain donuts. And this brings me to the next point. So I want to talk a little bit about the importance of history. I'm going to talk a little bit more about my buddy Che Guevara, right? If you've ever gone to a trendy restaurant in Parkhurst, you might have come across like one of the street vendors who sells pictures. One of the pictures he paints is a rendition of the famous funeral of Che Guevara. Now, obviously, you know, based on what you've heard, I really was quite curious. And I asked this guy, like, do you know this man killed many people? His reply was actually quite shocking. He simply shrugged and said, well, people wanted his picture. Okay, so I wasn't quite sure, like, the people who are buying, do they actually know? Or is he just a person who is ignorant in this case? Whatever the case, I call this the red velvet cake effect. Right, so everybody I meet seems to love red velvet cake. You can buy it in trendy coffee shops, in Pick and Pay, or from bakers or whatever. And everybody I meet seems to say they love red velvet cake. Okay, and to me, there is nothing more pointless than red velvet cake. Red velvet cake, if you don't know, is essentially ordinary cake, like an ordinary vanilla sponge cake that has cream or cream cheese icing, cream cheese icing that is traditionally colored with beetroot juice. Beetroot juice. So you want me to ingest something which is high in carbs and sugar, which is effectively flavored with beetroot juice. So the only reason I can use to explain the fact that red velvet cake is so popular is the fact that people are taken in by fashion. They don't actually have any inkling about what it is that they're consuming, what it is that they believe in. Effectively, they're just doing it because everybody in their in-group is eating red velvet cake. And they simply have no context or understanding of the bigger picture in order to allow them to make more intelligent choices. Okay. So in the picture I've showed you here, this is a microservice architecture. Okay, so I've got an API gateway. I use the gateway to funnel access for my consumers using open standards such as HTTP. I might translate this into something else like gRPC. That then goes and is routed to a set of services indicated by the gray blocks, service 1 through 5, and it's hosted on some type of service mesh. This may be a service mesh that is running on Kubernetes, for example. It gives additional services to your microservices that are running, things like sidecar services. It may take care of logging, monitoring, all that type of good stuff. So many years ago, this guy here, Jay Krebs. So Jay Krebs is basically the co-creator of Kafka and is the CEO of Confluent, the commercial company that actually sells Kafka and related products and services around Kafka. And he made this observation. Microservices are basically distributed objects for hipsters. And the reason he came to this conclusion is because the patterns are pretty obvious. So let's wind the clock back to 2002. And this would be the ultimate architecture that you would have used to implement your microservice architecture. So in our day, the open standard for accessing these things was called Corba. Your gateway was an ORB, an object request broker that worked together with an LDAP directory that allowed you to use standards to invoke your microservices. Your service mesh, we called a Java Enterprise Application Server because it basically gave you all the features that your modern service mesh and Kubernetes give you. And of course, the actual component model for implementing these things was EJB. So my microservice 1 through 5 is now replaced by EJB 1 through 5. And what he was basically trying to get to is that if you understand the patterns, if you know the history of what it is that you're working about, if you go a layer deeper than just looking at the architecture in its in its face value, you'll understand that there's a whole background of context that's important to actually doing these type of things. Why is this important? So if you implement a microservice architecture, I can almost promise you that you're going to run into exactly the same type of problems that we used to have when we develop EJB applications. So people come to me and say, hey, Julian, you know, managing 20 microservices is hard. Well, you think. Managing a fleet of 20 enterprise applications, J2E enterprise applications, was also hard. All the same type of patterns of deployment, everything applied all the way back then. And I see it happening all over again. In fact, a couple of years after the general consensus that was that we should move more back to monolithic apps. Everything is running together, so we don't have to deal with the complexity of all these components that are running loose inside our application service. And this brings me to the Dunning-Kruger effect. So another name for this is climbing Mount Stupid. And basically the way it works is you are now a young developer, for example. You've learned a little bit about something. Maybe you've been at your first job, and after that job, you suddenly decide that you are master of the world. The obvious problem is that you have no expertise to make any real decisions. So what inevitably happens is that you're overconfident about your own abilities, and you then go and apply these abilities without thinking or having the knowledge or expertise, whatever it is, that allows you to effectively apply the skills that you just learned. One of the joys of being an architect is that I get to deal with people who come after me to say that, who then try to second guess everything I've done. In fact, one of my favorite things that I hear is, we should be doing. And this is one of the things that induces me to roll my eyes. So I've got a system that I've developed over the years for dealing with this, right? So step one, I try to rationalize them and explain why their delusions of grandeur don't work. Step two, since they don't listen in step one, I then allow them to go ahead with what they're doing in step one. In fact, I even support it. So whatever delusion they have in their mind, I allow them to carry this out at full speed with my support. Step three, I allow them to run into the brick wall they're about to hit because they didn't listen to me in step one. Step four, I then try to pick them up off the ground, see if they've learned anything from the experience, dust them off, and then basically sit them down and say, okay, let's get to work now. And our industry is actually has a problem in this respect. So it's one of those other isms called ageism. And industry, and so experience as a whole in our industry is just not valued. So you often hear stories about people who are like me in their 40s, and they're basically, they won't get a job at a startup because of XYZ. And it is a problem. Like, who is actually the person who has the level of experience and expertise to actually tell you when you're going wrong, or to understand that that there's a deeper level to the skills you're about to imply? And this is why history becomes important, right? One of the most important things, most important bits of history that you have to take into account is your own history. How do you know, if you don't take your own history into account, what mistakes you've actually made? Can you recognize those things? Can you look in your past and say, hey, yep, I screwed up here? And if you don't do that, you'll never be able to understand or to be able to learn deeper and then not to make those mistakes again. Without knowing history, you are well doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. So how do you actually go about fixing this, right? How do you become a bit more cynical, at least positively? So the first thing I want to tell you is that time is important. And going back a bit to my talk on the history, we can't see forward, but we do have an inkling about what happened in the past. The past gives us the context about the now, and it allows us to actually have a thought about where we want to go. And one of the things that you have to realize in your career is that building software is actually a journey. It's something, it sounds contrite, but it is true, right? You start with something, and that something has to evolve into something that is more valuable than what it is right now. And what I often see with developers is they look at a system and they get all upset because the system in its current state isn't where you want it to be. But what they don't understand is that that doesn't mean that where it is today, it's going to be the same tomorrow. And usually what I tend to see happen is when you adopt this mindset, this type of thinking ends up in disillusionment, right? Because you start on that project, you realize, you're not in Denmark anymore and there are real problems. And you simply get to a point and you feel hopeless. You don't know where to go. One of the biggest differentiators for me between an architect and a team lead is simply the ability to recognize this. If you had to ask me, what is a good architecture? It's really quite simple. It's an architecture that can evolve. All the patterns, all the practices, everything in between that you use is really just the shiny bits that allows you to make a system evolve over time. And of course, none of this comes with without having a bit of perspective, right? So let's look at software. Software is a pain in the backside. It's expensive to build. It takes forever to build. It never works exactly like you want it. And quite frankly, the people who build it are prima donnas. One of my learnings when I was a paper solutions architect is that not needing to go and actually have to write any code to solve a problem is a definite win. And quite frankly, if I could get AIs to write their own code, I would absolutely do it. And I think the research should be given priority so that we can finally get rid of developers who are effectively the middlemen between the machine and the software. And this is something that I find often, right? So why do I say people are prima donnas? Or developers are prima donnas is because they simply don't take into account the fact that they're only a small piece of a bigger system. You should actually go out and understand the system, the bigger system, the business, all the processes, all the bits and pieces that go about around the things that you're trying to implement. And maybe if you got that perspective, you could actually start focusing on helping our clients meet their goals instead of nitpicking about the bloody linting tool. Part of learning perspective, of course, is examining your own beliefs. And it can be about anything, right? So it can be about your political beliefs and it can be about your technology beliefs. So in all of this, I've been talking a bit about the bigger picture. Are you perhaps missing the bigger picture? Do you like red velvet cake and you have no idea why you like red velvet cake? How do you avoid buying lies that turn you into a useful idiot? If you're a fan of language X and hate language Y, have you ever worked in language Y to honestly hold any real opinion over that other than it sucks because it's not part of your in-group? This is something that's really hard to do, right? To really hold on to the beliefs to really make them their own, to say that it's not part of any group context or it's something that you can actually believe in. You have to put your own beliefs through the grinder. You have to honestly assess your own biases and prejudices and look at it and see, okay, you know what, this is right, this is wrong. And the payoff is very simple. It makes you harder to be somebody's useful idiot because quite frankly, if you have that level of depth around what you know, then it's easier to spot when somebody is trying to push something on you. You get the chance to see a much bigger world than the one that you're currently living in and maybe get an appreciation for what the other people are doing. And finally, it's not to kill your own beliefs that you should examine them. It's more really to more truly say that they're your own beliefs, that you can honestly say that, yes, I can believe in this. I've done everything. I'm at ease with my conscience. So they say that millennials are driven by experiences. Unfortunately, it seems that those experiences exclude bad experiences. And it's a rather a pity, right? Because I've learned a whole lot more from when things go wrong than when they go right. One of the favorite things I like to ask in interviews is please explain to me how things went wrong and what you learned in the process. And if the candidate actually picks up on that and they start talking about how they personally messed things up, then I can see A, that they embraced failure, and B, that they were willing to actually sit down and say, yes, I messed up, but this is what I have learned. And what that tells me is that that candidate is at least smart enough to piece together how things actually happened and their own role in making a mess. And that gives them, that at least tells me that they've got enough humility that they're able to learn effectively and that I can actually work with this person. Then finally, the last thing I want to talk to you about is that you need to do something hard. All right, so everybody wants to be a hero. Well, the problem is, of course, that you need to do some heroic deeds in order to be a hero. And while they tend to be rather painful at times, in this case, it could be quite deadly. And certainly, like slaying the dragon is not very easy, and neither is building a very complex financial system. Now, I see people hankering towards the green fields. In fact, like even it's normally used in job interviews. It's like you're interviewing for, this is a greenfields project, you get to do whatever you like. I can almost tell you that that greenfield project, every single system started out as a greenfield project. And most of the time, greenfields projects turn into the boulevard of broken dreams. Everything started out as something fantastic and turned into a nightmare, including some of the things you've probably worked on. What I'd like to ask you is, have you ever turned a nightmare into something that you can be proud of? Is it better to slay the dragon or just walk in through the front door? And quite honestly, people will remember the time you slayed the dragon. They're not going to remember the time you just joined the army walking through the front door. And that comes to my favorite part. Does anybody have any questions?
All right, we're going to take it to the field. I did want to know, Julian, you commented a little bit on what makes great architecture, and specifically when it comes to team leading and architecture, how these things interact with each other. But do you believe that these hallmarks also are true for someone in a technical lead perspective, or someone as a senior wanting to move into these things? What are the marks of someone looking through that process, or what would you see as a flag for that rather?
Well, I think the big thing is the ability to learn from your mistakes. Like really, if a person comes to me and says, well, you know, I screwed up here, I'm not going to do this again because of X, Y, Z. And like that to me is a good marker. If you're prone to the Dunning-Kruger effect, and you sort of keep feeling that nobody recognizes your greatness, that's definitely not a marker.
Absolutely. And then maybe something a little tangible. We actually, on the topic of people being very specific about the type of languages that they work with, would you encourage people to experiment with different platforms?
Hell yes.
Okay.
Just like, look guys, you're a developer. Okay, like if you don't experiment with other platforms, can you honestly say that you know your craft? Okay, can you tell me the difference between a dynamic language and a static language? Can you tell me what a functional language is? Can you tell me what an object-oriented language is? Do you know what the relationships is between the two things? Do you know what are the pros and cons of it? How do you learn that unless you go and try the platforms?
Absolutely. And I see Raymond has commented and said, remember, open source equals open-minded. What do you say to that?
I could use an unpleasant word, All I'll say is that open source people can also be completely useless non-team players.
Okay, and I see Jock has asked, how do you turn the nightmare into the dream? I know this is very subjective and needs a lot more allocated time, but what would you say?
Well, you have to slay the dragon, right? So like that requires hard work. It's in often cases it means having fights and working late and having to find some common ground with people you completely disagree about. So apparently I'm accused of being a bully sometimes, but that actually works. I have a tendency in meetings to resort to something called reducto ad absurdum, which basically means in any meeting I like to reduce everything into the absurdities. And what I find works well in these type of situations is it kind of aligns everybody's thinking to say, well, hey, you know, this is actually not such, this is not a life and death situation. You know, so there is actually the ability to think. And another thing that sometimes you just have to give in. Sometimes you've got to take one for the team and say, well, okay, I can work with this. I can live with this. I will do it.
Awesome. And I think one last question before we start wrapping up. You guys are also welcome to leave them in the comments and we will get back to them afterwards. But our last question is from Yadir, and it says, what was one of your biggest mistakes and what did you learn from it in your career? Perhaps let us know one of your failure highlights.
I became an architect too quickly. So, and I don't think I was ready for dealing with the kind of toxic mess and politics that comes with it, right? So, and I mean, fundamentally, all I wanted to do is write great systems, and it doesn't work like that, you know. So all the things I've been telling you about, I didn't listen to. You know, I simply, and that led to a sense of disillusionment when I was like 2 years into being an architect, and I had to sort of go back and say, well, you know what, I need to put this into context.
And how did you pull back from that? How did you give yourself the perspective?
Sure. In my case, I was basically diagnosed with chronic stress. So like there was a health aspect to this where the doctor kind of said, listen, you need to like take a step back here. And, you know, my wife was telling me, look, it's the only time she's ever like threatened to divorce me was like during this period where I was dealing with this. And one of the key things I think that I didn't know was how to delegate effectively. I've always had the ability to say like less is more. So it's not like I take on, you know, when I'm dealing with things that I'm afraid to give it away, but still like, you try to be everything to everyone. And that almost killed me, literally.
Now, we are very glad that you survived and that you actually could share all of this with us. It was a fantastic talk. I think I speak for everyone when I say there's a lot of content to digest, and I will definitely be going back to the talk and making some crypt notes and putting sticky notes around my desk to remember how this works. And last, final question before we head up is from Gilad, and it says, how does one find the balance between micromanaging and delegating tasks to your team?
If I knew the answer to that, it wouldn't be an issue.
Absolutely. All right. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. We loved having you. If you've got more questions, feel free to leave them with us and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We loved having you. We'll see you guys very soon in the next one. Thank you so much, Peter and Julian. This was superb, and we'll see you all very soon. Goodbye for now.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.